Why won't anyone help her? Lucy asked as the older woman's knees buckled beside a row of empty gold chairs. Vanessa Cole had just pulled the nearest chair beyond her reach, smiling as though she were correcting a harmless seating error. Dan Mercer crossed the ballroom, dragged it back, wiped the cushion with a white napkin, and opened his hand toward the woman. Behind her temporary staff badge, a sliver of tarnished bronze caught the chandelier light. "Security," Vanessa whispered into her radio. "Keep this discreet." 3 hours earlier, the Whitmore Grand had smelled of lemon polish, hot wiring, and floral perfume expensive enough to linger after the guests moved on. Dan stood beneath the revolving anniversary logo in Founders Hall, testing microphone cables while Lucy colored quietly beside the technical table. His white shirt sleeves were rolled evenly to his forearms, his navy tie already loosened, and Sarah's old watch pressed cool against his wrist each time he checked the schedule. One missed cue tonight could cost him the contract. 2 missed payments could cost them the apartment. He said none of that to Lucy. He only showed her where to sit, introduced her to the banquet supervisor watching the children's corner, and reminded her not to wander behind the stage. Across the room, Vanessa adjusted place cards with gloved precision. She greeted donors by name, remembered allergies, and corrected staff without raising her voice. Nothing about her seemed cruel. That was what made the small things harder to notice. A server with gray hair was moved away from the front tables because she looked tired. A dishwasher carrying clean glassware was redirected through the kitchen because guests were taking photographs. Then Eleanor appeared beside a cleaning cart in a plain gray uniform, her silver hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck. She moved slowly, but her eyes traveled over the ballroom with unsettling familiarity. Past the new chandeliers, past the sponsor wall, toward an old carved doorway concealed behind velvet drapes. Vanessa noticed her looking. "Temporary staff remain in service areas," she said pleasantly. Eleanor nodded once and pushed her cart toward the wall. She did not protest when 2 guests set empty champagne glasses on top of her folded towels. She simply removed the glasses, refolded the towel beneath them, and continued working. Dan saw her pause near the gold chairs. Her fingers tightened around the cart handle. Her breath came shallow enough to lift only the top of her shoulders. Before he could reach her, Eleanor touched one chair for balance. Vanessa crossed the floor and pulled it away. The chair legs scraped marble with a sharp, ugly sound that cut beneath the quartet's music. Lucy looked up. Several adults did too, then quickly returned to their conversations. "Those seats are assigned," Vanessa said, though the table held no place cards. Eleanor's hand remained suspended where the chair had been. Lucy pointed not at the woman, but at the empty seat. "Why won't anyone help her?" The question carried farther than her small voice should have. Dan felt every practical reason to stay still, the contract, the rent, the eyes of the donors, but he was already moving. He pulled the chair back, wiped away a faint ring of condensation, and offered it without asking Eleanor's name. "Please," he said. Vanessa's smile hardened by less than an inch. "Mr. Mercer, you're disrupting the room." Dan kept one hand on the chair. "A chair didn't disrupt this room. The way you took it did." Eleanor lowered herself carefully, studying Lucy before looking up at him. "Does she always notice what adults pretend not to see?" Before Dan could answer, Marcus Hale entered through the ballroom doors. The security chief's gaze passed over Dan, Vanessa, and the gathering guests, then stopped on the bronze edge beneath Eleanor's badge. For one heartbeat, Marcus forgot to breathe. Etched into the metal was the faded outline of the Whitmore doorway, and beneath it, almost hidden by the plastic name card, the first word of an older title, Founding. Marcus's eyes stayed on the half-hidden word beneath Eleanor's plastic badge, but Vanessa stepped between them before he could look closer. "Ms. Hale is tired," she said smoothly, using the wrong name with such confidence that 2 nearby guests accepted it as fact. "Mr. Mercer misunderstood the seating plan. We'll correct this without disturbing anyone." Dan noticed the shift immediately. Eleanor had not given a last name, and Marcus had not spoken. Yet Vanessa was already building a version of the moment in which the older woman was confused and Dan was careless. Her name is Eleanor, Dan said. She needs a minute. You've done enough. Then show me the rule. The quartet continued beneath the chandelier light, bows moving in soft unison, while a champagne glass chimed against a tray. Vanessa's smile never vanished, but she turned her body just enough to exclude Dan from the small circle she had created around Eleanor. Mr. Mercer is a contract event worker, she told Marcus. He handles cables and room transitions. Guest management is outside his role. The words were mild, almost helpful, but one donor glanced at Dan's rolled sleeves and worn watch as if Vanessa had explained why he should not be trusted. Another whispered, temporary staff always want to make something personal, then looked away when Lucy heard him. Dan crouched beside his daughter instead of answering. He straightened the strap of her small bag, checked that her tablet was still on the technical table, and told her quietly to stay where the banquet supervisor could see her. Did I do something wrong? Lucy asked. No. Is she in trouble? Not because of you. Dan stood before the fear in her face could become shame. Vanessa was already kneeling beside Eleanor, her voice warm enough to sound compassionate from a distance. You may be disoriented. That happens during crowded events. Mr. Hale will escort you somewhere quieter. Eleanor's fingers rested on the chair Dan had pulled out. The knuckles were pale, but her voice remained level. I know where I am. Of course you do. Then why are you speaking for me? For the first time, Vanessa's eyes tightened. Only for a second. Then she turned to Marcus and said the rear service exit would be safest because photographers were gathering near the lobby. Marcus glanced toward the ballroom's main doors, which stood open and almost empty, then toward the steel door behind the catering station. The service corridor beyond it smelled of hot metal, dish soap, and onions from the hotel kitchen. She should be assessed before she leaves, he said. Liability protocol. Vanessa's smile cooled. I'm asking for discretion, Marcus. And I'm documenting a possible medical concern. Dan heard the careful emphasis. Marcus was not refusing her. He was using the hotel's own procedure to slow her down. Vanessa turned back to Dan. Your contract gives us broad discretion when a vendor interferes with guest experience. I'd hate for one emotional misunderstanding to affect future work. She let her gaze fall to Sarah's old watch, then to the inexpensive polish on Dan's shoes. People in uncertain positions sometimes feel pressure to prove themselves. Dan absorbed the insult without moving. I'm not trying to prove anything. Then step aside. Not until she says she wants to go. The air between them tightened while the ballroom carried on around it. A server passed with a tray of miniature crab cakes, carefully avoiding the scene. Eleanor looked at Dan differently then, not with gratitude, but with attention, as though his refusal to perform anger had unsettled an assumption she had made about him. Marcus reached for the handle of her cleaning cart and eased it away from the aisle. A heavy brass key slipped from beneath a folded towel, struck the marble, and spun once before settling near Vanessa's shoe. The metal bore the same old doorway emblem as the badge, darkened by years of handling. Below it were 3 deeply cut characters. N.B-1. Vanessa placed the toe of her black heel over the key. That may belong to the hotel, she said. We'll secure it. Eleanor's hand moved toward the floor, but Vanessa was already signaling Marcus to collect it. Dan stepped closer, then stopped an arm's length away. If you think it was stolen, document it in front of a witness. This is not your concern. You made it my concern when you accused her before checking. I did not accuse anyone. You put your foot on the evidence. Vanessa slowly lifted her shoe. Dan crouched, picked up the key by its edges, and placed it in Eleanor's open palm. It was colder than the room, and a trace of gray dust marked the center of his thumb. Does this belong to you? He asked. Eleanor closed her fingers around it. It did once. Vanessa spoke too quickly. Old hotel keys remain company property regardless of who carried them. Marcus looked at her. Which lock does it fit? The pause was small, but it was the first pause Vanessa had not chosen. That isn't relevant. You said it was hotel property. Because it bears the old mark. Eleanor studied her now, the exhaustion in her face giving way to something quieter and sharper. Which door am I allowed to use? The appropriate one, Vanessa replied. Dan looked toward the main lobby, bright and open, then toward the narrow steel door behind the kitchen carts. A door becomes inappropriate when you use it to hide people. Vanessa's expression remained polite, but the hand holding her radio had gone rigid. Marcus moved Eleanor's cart toward the service hall, still using medical protocol as a shield against immediate removal. Dan walked beside the chair until Eleanor was steady, while Lucy remained safely at the technical table, watching with both hands wrapped around her tablet. At the threshold, Eleanor glanced toward a sealed wooden door at the far end of the corridor, nearly concealed behind stacked banquet risers. The north ballroom passage used to be wider, she murmured. Marcus stopped so abruptly that one wheel of the cart squeaked against the tile. Vanessa said nothing, but her thumb pressed the radio button without transmitting. Dan looked down at the brass key in Eleanor's hand. The letters NB no longer looked like random initials, and Vanessa, who claimed not to know what the key opened, had begun staring at that sealed door. The sealed door at the end of the corridor stayed closed, but Vanessa's eyes remained fixed on the brass key in Eleanor's hand. She needs to be moved, she said. Now. Marcus glanced at the older woman's face, then at the faint tremor in her fingers. She needs water first. That is not your call. It is if she falls. The service corridor hummed with refrigeration units and the distant clatter of silverware. Under the fluorescent lights, Eleanor looked smaller than she had beneath the chandeliers, the gray uniform hanging loosely from her shoulders, the bronze edge of the hidden badge dull against the plastic name card. Dan noticed she had stopped looking at the sealed door. She was staring at the floor instead, breathing through her nose as if each breath required a decision. There's a break room around the corner, he said. Vanessa turned to him. You are still assigned to Founders Hall. The audio check is complete. Then return to your station. Dan looked toward the ballroom, where Lucy sat within sight of the banquet supervisor, her yellow sun tablet case bright against the black technical table. Then he looked back at Eleanor. 5 minutes, he said. She eats, drinks, and decides for herself. Vanessa gave a soft, disappointed laugh. You mistake impulsiveness for integrity. Dan did not answer. He took the handle of the cleaning cart from Marcus and guided it through the narrow doorway without bumping Eleanor's wrist. The break room smelled of burnt coffee and industrial soap. One fluorescent tube flickered above a scarred laminate table. Dan pulled out a plastic chair, wiped away a crescent of dried sugar, and waited until Eleanor sat before opening his lunch bag. Inside was a chicken sandwich wrapped in wax paper and one red apple. He had packed it at 6 that morning while Lucy slept at the kitchen counter, her cheek resting on a spelling worksheet. He had planned to eat half during setup and save the rest for the drive home. Rent was due in 4 days. His next contract payment would not clear for 9. Dan separated the sandwich carefully, moving one piece of chicken from his half to hers before placing it on a napkin. You need this more than I do. Eleanor looked at the larger half. And what will you eat? The apple. You have a child. She ate before we came. Lucy appeared in the doorway but stayed beside the banquet supervisor as she had been told. She looked at the 2 sandwich halves, then at her father. Dad, you always say the bigger half is an accident. Dan almost smiled. Sometimes it is. Eleanor's mouth softened, but she did not take the food. I don't accept charity. Good, Dan said, sliding the napkin closer. This is dinner. Lucy reached into her small backpack and placed a sealed packet of crackers beside Eleanor's water cup. These are extra, she said, though Dan knew they were the snack she saved for the ride home. Then she returned to the doorway without waiting for praise. Eleanor watched her go. Only then did she lift the sandwich. She ate slowly, holding the wax paper beneath it so no crumbs touched the table. Vanessa entered before Eleanor finished the second bite. She carried a clipboard against her navy dress and wore the same expression she used with donors who complained about floral arrangements. I have resolved this, she said. Mr. Mercer can retain tonight's assignment if he signs an incident acknowledgement. She placed the form in front of him and clicked a black pen. Dan read the first paragraph while the refrigerator motor shuddered behind him. The report described Eleanor as confused, non-compliant, and disruptive to guest experience. It stated that she had refused a lawful escort and accused staff of mistreatment. None of it had happened. Sign at the bottom, Vanessa said. This protects everyone. It protects the story you wrote. It documents the event. It replaces it. Vanessa lowered her voice. You have a daughter sitting in a hotel at night because you cannot afford childcare. Do not turn a temporary assignment into a moral performance. Dan's thumb moved across Sarah's watch without conscious thought. The scratched steel back held only her name and a date he never allowed himself to read during work. He set the pen down, drew one clean line through the false description, and wrote beneath it. Elderly staff member became unsteady after being denied a vacant chair. She did not raise her voice, enter a restricted area, or refuse medical assistance. He added his initials beside every correction. Vanessa's smile vanished for less than a second. You cannot alter an official report. Then don't ask me to sign one that was wrong before it was printed. Eleanor stopped chewing. Dan tapped the top corner of the page. The incident time read 7:42 p.m. The digital clock above the vending machine read 7:31. Your system is 11 minutes ahead, Vanessa said too quickly. Dan took out his phone, photographed the report beside the wall clock, and emailed the image to himself. Then maintenance can confirm it. Vanessa reached for the paper, but he kept one hand flat on it without pulling back. You'll get the original after I receive a copy. She looked at Eleanor as though the older woman had engineered the entire exchange. This is what happens when people confuse attention with kindness. Eleanor folded the wax paper into a small square and slipped it into her uniform pocket. No, she said quietly. This is what happens when kindness leaves a record. Vanessa gathered the clipboard and walked out, her heels striking the tile in measured beats. Dan turned to return the brass key, which Eleanor had set beside the water cup. As he lifted it, his thumb brushed gray dust from the old doorway emblem, revealing the same oxidized bronze beneath her plastic badge. Lucy leaned closer from the doorway, squinting at the piece of metal hidden behind Eleanor's name card. Dad, she whispered, that doesn't say janitor. Eleanor's hand rose too late to cover it. For one clear second, Dan saw the two words stamped beneath the hotel's original mark. Founding partner. Dan saw the words clearly, but he did not say them aloud. Founding partner could mean ownership, history, ceremony, or nothing more than an old badge purchased at an estate sale. The bronze was scratched, the plastic janitor tag was newer, and Eleanor had already admitted the brass key once belonged to her. None of that proved who she was now. Vanessa returned before Lucy could ask another question. Cover that, she said. Eleanor's fingers closed over the badge. Why? Because it is confusing the child. She read two words. She misunderstood them. Vanessa reached toward Eleanor's chest, but Dan placed the copied report between them without touching either woman. She can adjust her own badge. The break room seemed to shrink around the scrape of the refrigerator motor. Coffee had burned to a dark ring in the glass pot, and the fluorescent tube above them flickered twice before holding steady. Vanessa looked at Dan as if his calmness made him more troublesome than anger would have. You've interfered with guest operations, altered a formal document, and photographed internal material, she said. From this point forward, anything you handle may be treated as compromised. The accusation was not unreasonable on its face. Dan was a contractor, not an investigator. He had touched the key, amended the report, and emailed himself a photograph taken inside a private workplace. Marcus stood near the doorway, listening without stepping in. Even Eleanor watched Dan with guarded attention, as though waiting to see whether he would use the badge to invent a dramatic story. Dan slid his phone into his pocket. Then we should stop handling things without witnesses. Vanessa's eyes moved to the brass key beside Eleanor's water cup. That key belongs in secured storage. Which storage? Dan asked. The question was simple enough that the refrigerator's low hum seemed louder after it. Vanessa folded her arms. An inactive service area. Which one? The Old North section. Eleanor looked up. Marcus's gaze sharpened. Dan placed the key beneath the direct light of the vending machine, careful to hold it only by the narrow edge. Gray residue remained in the grooves of the old doorway emblem. Beneath the letters N.B. -1, a shallow line had been worn into the metal by years of turning in the same direction. You said you didn't know what it opened, he said. Vanessa did not blink. I said it was irrelevant. You also called it company property before anyone identified the lock. The original logo makes that obvious. The original logo is hidden under dirt. Vanessa looked down too quickly. The movement lasted less than a second, but Eleanor saw it. So did Marcus. Vanessa recovered by gathering the clipboard against her chest. This is becoming inappropriate. Eleanor will remain here while security verifies the item. Mr. Mercer will return to the ballroom. Am I being detained? Eleanor asked. No, am I free to leave? Through the staff exit, once the concern is resolved. Then I am being contained with better vocabulary. Vanessa exhaled through her nose, still smiling. You are being protected from a misunderstanding. Dan looked at the sealed wooden door visible beyond the break room window. A stack of banquet risers partly concealed its brass handle. The paint around the lock was newer than the door, but a thin crescent of dark would showed where the handle had been turned recently. Does NB stand for North Ballroom? He asked. Vanessa answered before Eleanor could. There hasn't been a North Ballroom in 20 years. Eleanor's expression changed, not enough to reveal certainty, but enough to show that Vanessa had said more than she intended. Dan picked up the key with a clean paper napkin and handed it back to Eleanor. Did you work here when it was open? Eleanor studied the old metal in her palm. I worked here before anyone called this place grand. It was not an answer, and Dan did not pretend it was. He led the way into the corridor with Marcus behind them and Lucy remaining safely beside the banquet supervisor. The sealed door stood beneath a failing fluorescent light that buzzed like an insect trapped in glass. Eleanor inserted the key. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the lock turned with a deep mechanical click. Cold, dusty air moved through the opening. Inside, faded boxes leaned against the walls. An old wooden chair sat beneath a stained sheet, and a framed photograph rested face down on a cabinet. Dan stopped everyone at the threshold. Nobody touches anything until we record how it was found. Marcus raised his radio and stated the time. Dan photographed the doorway, the floor, and the unopened boxes from outside the room. Eleanor stared at the sheet-covered chair as though it had spoken her name. Vanessa arrived at the end of the corridor, her heels striking harder than before. She did not ask how the key had opened a forgotten room. She did not ask whether anyone was hurt. Her first words were, "What did she take out?" Silence settled over the corridor. Dan turned slowly toward her. Behind him, a corner of the sheet slipped from the old chair, revealing scorched wood and the same doorway emblem stamped into its back. Then Marcus's radio vibrated once against his belt. A private message appeared on its small screen. Camera 9 redirected 2 minutes ago. Camera 9 redirected 2 minutes ago. Marcus read the message twice, then angled the radio screen toward Dan without handing it over. Beyond the open archive door, dust hung in the beam of the failing fluorescent light. Vanessa stood at the far end of the corridor with one hand pressed lightly against her clipboard, her expression still composed. "There's no reason for anyone to be alarmed," she said. "The cameras are being adjusted for guest privacy." Dan looked past her toward the ceiling dome above the service intersection. It had been facing the archive entrance when they arrived. Now the dark lens pointed toward a blank section of wall. "Who ordered the adjustment?" he asked. "I did." "For which guest?" "That information is confidential." "Then repeat the instruction over the main security channel." Vanessa's smile held, but her fingers tightened around the clipboard. "Mr. Mercer, Camera operations are not part of your assignment. Neither is losing footage beside an open, restricted room. Nothing has been lost. Then the order can be recorded.
Marcus watched dan more carefully.
There was no challenge in his voice, no attempt to take command. Dan was doing what years of event logistics had taught him to do whenever equipment, timing, and liability collided. Identify the instruction, confirm the source, preserve the sequence. Vanessa turned to Marcus. Redirect cameras 7 through 11 for 10 minutes. We have donors crossing the service route. Marcus lifted his radio. Confirming instruction from Vanessa Cole to redirect cameras 7 through 11 for 10 minutes. The words traveled through the official channel with a burst of static. Somewhere behind the ballroom walls, the security recording box captured the transmission. Vanessa's hand rose quickly. I said adjust the angles as needed. Do not make it sound like a blackout. Then which cameras stay on the archive door? Dan asked. The refrigeration fans seemed to grow louder. Vanessa looked toward the ceiling, calculating. Camera 12 covers the intersection. Marcus checked his screen. 12 is blocked by the banquet risers. For the first time, no. One spoke over the machinery. Eleanor stood just inside the archive threshold, one hand resting near the tarnished founding partner badge beneath her plastic name tag. She did not look triumphant. She looked tired. Move the risers, Vanessa said, and let me handle this privately. Dan glanced at the stacked platforms. Moving them would take several minutes and place workers directly inside the unrecorded space. No one enters until one camera sees the door, he said. Vanessa lowered her voice. You are making a routine correction look suspicious. I'm making the correction visible. Marcus keyed his radio and ordered a portable hallway camera brought down. Vanessa did not object again, but the pulse in her neck had begun to show. Dan stepped away from the archive and looked toward the ballroom entrance. Lucy was still beside the banquet supervisor, hugging her yellow Sun tablet case against her chest. When she saw him, her shoulders loosened. He walked over, crouched, and asked whether she was all right. I thought they were going to make the lady leave, she said. Not while she needs help. I made a video of the old logo. Lucy opened the tablet and showed him a short clip she had recorded earlier from the technical table. The image shook slightly as she zoomed toward the anniversary emblem on the ballroom screen. Dan was about to tell her it was good when a woman's voice sounded in the background. Vanessa's voice. Get her through the back corridor before Richard arrives. Dan stopped the video. Did you change anything?
No.
I just watched it. Did you send it to anyone? Lucy shook her head. Dan did not replay the line. He switched the tablet to airplane mode, then carried it back toward Marcus with Lucy and the banquet supervisor following at a safe distance. Original device, he said quietly. We make one copy by cable. You witness it. She keeps the tablet. Marcus nodded. Agreed. Eleanor listened from the doorway. One sentence can embarrass a person, she said. It may not prove what you think. Dan connected the tablet to a secure laptop but kept his hands visible. That's why we preserve it before we interpret it. Vanessa approached her. Tone gentle again. A child's recording taken in a private workplace raises legal concerns. Let me secure the device. Dan closed the laptop halfway. It belongs to my daughter. Then you should protect her from being involved. I am. He turned the screen so Marcus could see the file information. The recording time was 7:29 p.m., 13 minutes before the incident report claimed Eleanor had refused escort and caused a disturbance. Marcus wrote the time in the service log. Then he opened the camera control history. The change to camera 9 had not begun when Vanessa reached the corridor. An automatic redirect command had already been scheduled 3 days earlier. Vanessa's face did not change, but Eleanor slowly lowered her hand from the badge. Who scheduled it? Dan asked. Marcus scrolled. Administrative access. Secondary account. Whose? The account is masked. Vanessa stepped closer. That proves only a maintenance setting. We should stop before people build a conspiracy out of routine software. Dan did not answer. Marcus expanded the history farther back. 6 earlier nights appeared on the screen, each showing the same 10-minute gap on camera 9. Beside every date was a closed employee complaint number. 6 complaint numbers sat beside 6 identical gaps in camera 9. Marcus opened the first file. The service corridor's fluorescent light flickered across the laptop screen, turning the white page gray for half a second. Employee failed to follow verbal direction, he read. Employee appeared confused. Employee disrupted guest experience. Dan leaned closer without touching the keyboard. Open the next one. The second report described an older banquet server who had worked at the Whitmore Grand for 16 years. It used the same 3 phrases. The third concerned a deaf dishwasher accused of deliberately ignoring instructions. The fourth blamed a maintenance worker for entering a VIP hallway while repairing a leaking pipe. Different dates, different supervisors, the same sentence structure, down to the same misspelling of accommodation. Eleanor stepped out of the archive and rested one hand on the scorched wooden chair beneath the fallen sheet. The burned edge pressed a dark line against her palm. Those people weren't confused, she said. Vanessa appeared behind Marcus, phone held tightly against her dress. Template language is standard practice. Similar wording proves consistency, not misconduct. Then why did the cameras fail on the same nights? Dan asked. Equipment does fail. For exactly 10 minutes? You are not qualified to interpret security software. Dan did not argue. He took strips of paper tape from his event kit and began building a timeline on the archive wall. Blue tape marked confirmed times. Yellow marked unanswered questions. Red marked conclusions no one was allowed to make yet. Marcus watched him place each complaint beside its matching camera gap. Eleanor watched him leave Vanessa's name off the wall entirely. You're protecting her, Marcus said quietly. I'm protecting the evidence, Dan replied. If we accuse faster than we can prove, every victim becomes easier to dismiss. Vanessa's phone vibrated. She silenced it too quickly, then wiped one thumb across the corner of the screen. This has gone far enough. Mrs. Whitmore should be removed from the building while legal reviews the records. The corridor went still. Eleanor turned her head. Dan did too. No one had introduced her by that name. Vanessa's face remained composed, but the color had left the skin beneath her makeup. You called her Eleanor before, Dan said. Now you called her Mrs. Whitmore. It was printed on an old personnel file. Which one? Vanessa looked toward the open boxes instead of answering. Eleanor slowly removed the plastic janitor tag from her uniform. Behind it, the bronze badge caught the cold light in full. Founding partner 1987. She placed it on the archive table beside the brass key. Then she lifted the framed photograph Dan had left untouched. The glass was cracked across one corner. In it, a younger Thomas Whitmore stood beside a woman whose face had been hidden by a fold. Eleanor unfolded the paper backing with careful fingers. The second half of the caption appeared. Thomas and Eleanor Whitmore opening night. Marcus stopped scrolling. Vanessa's phone vibrated again. This time she let it ring. A photograph is not authority, she said. A badge can be removed from storage. Eleanor looked at Dan, not at her. She is right about one thing. Objects can be planted.
Dan nodded.
Then we verify the objects before anyone uses them. From a lower archive box, Marcus pulled 6 and signed letters addressed to Eleanor Whitmore. Each described being sent through the back corridor after raising a complaint. Each used different handwriting. Each mentioned camera 9. Beneath them lay a memorandum titled Visual Suitability Standards, approved electronically by Richard Whitmore. Eleanor sat on the scorched chair. For several seconds, only the ventilation fan moved. My son may not have designed this, she said, but he signed the room it lived in. Dan saw the decision forming in her face before she spoke. She could reveal herself now, walk into Founders Hall, and end Vanessa's authority with a single sentence. Don't, he said. Eleanor's eyes hardened. You don't know what I can stop. I know what happens if this becomes one powerful woman against one manager. She gets blamed, everyone applauds, and the system keeps the template. Marcus opened a secondary access log. The account that scheduled the camera gaps carried no employee name, only approval from Richard's executive office. Vanessa reached for the laptop. Legal needs to take control. Marcus closed the screen before she touched it. Dan placed the complaint files, the camera log, the false report, and the founding partner badge in a single evidence line beneath the archive light. Nothing on the table could explain everything alone. Together, they had become too heavy for a private correction. Then Marcus found an old recording box beneath the cabinet and read the label on its last preserved file. Investor Comfort Protocol R. Whitmore and V. Cole. From the ballroom beyond the service doors came the first notes of Richard Whitmore's speech about 39 years of respect. Founders Hall had already gone quiet for Richard Whitmore's speech when the service door opened behind the last row of tables. Dan entered first, carrying the gold chair by its back so the legs would not scrape the marble. His sleeves were still rolled, his blue tie hung slightly crooked, and exhaustion had settled into the lines around his eyes. Eleanor followed beside her cleaning cart, still wearing the gray janitor uniform. Marcus walked behind them with the sealed evidence pouch and the old recording box tucked beneath one arm. On stage, Richard stood beneath the original Whitmore doorway emblem and spoke about 39 years of respect. Vanessa saw them before he did. She crossed the ballroom without hurrying, her professional smile restored. "Mr. Mercer," she said softly, "you are interrupting a board presentation. We need 5 minutes. You need to leave. Then say that on the microphone." Nearby conversations stopped one by one. Vanessa turned toward the guests and lifted a calming hand. "There has been a misunderstanding involving a temporary worker and an elderly employee who may be confused. Mr. Mercer has taken internal materials, altered an incident report, and involved his child in a workplace dispute. The explanation was polished, reasonable, and almost complete enough to win." A donor near the aisle frowned at Dan. Another raised his phone. Richard stepped down from the stage, his expression controlled. "Is any person in immediate danger?" "No," Marcus said. "Then nobody touches the files until counsel is present." Vanessa's shoulders loosened. For one moment, it looked as though procedure had returned the room to her. "Thank you," she said. "I can resolve this privately." Dan set the gold chair in the same place where Vanessa had pulled it away from Eleanor. Lucy stood safely beside the banquet supervisor near the technical table, both hands wrapped around her yellow Sun tablet case. She did not approach. She only watched her father place the first document on the chair. "This is the report I was asked to sign," Dan said. "It states the disturbance occurred at 7:42. Vanessa folded her hands. The system clock was incorrect. Dan placed his phone beside the paper. On the screen was the photograph of the report beneath the break room clock reading 7:31. Then the description was written 11 minutes before the conduct it describes. The room did not erupt. Slowed. A server carrying a tray stopped near the kitchen doors. Richard looked at Vanessa. "Can the timestamp be independently verified?" "Yes," she said, "and it will show a routine system discrepancy." Her answer was quick enough to sound prepared. Richard nodded once, and several board members seemed ready to accept it. Dan placed Lucy's tablet on the chair but kept one hand over the screen. "The original file stays on the device. Only the metadata and audio copy are being presented." Lucy looked at Marcus and said, "I didn't change it. I was filming the old logo." Her voice was small, and the banquet supervisor rested a hand on her shoulder. Marcus displayed the file time, 7:29 p.m. Then he played only the necessary line. Vanessa's voice came through the ballroom speakers, low but clear. "Get her through the back corridor before Richard arrives." The chandelier glass seemed to hold its breath. Vanessa recovered first. "That proves context was missing. I was protecting an elderly worker from public embarrassment." "Then why redirect the cameras?" Dan asked. Marcus placed the service log beside the false report. Camera 9 had turned away 2 minutes before Eleanor entered the archive corridor. Vanessa looked toward Richard. "Donor privacy. A scheduled setting." "Scheduled by whom?" Richard asked. A secondary administrative account. Authorized by my office, Richard said, and the admission changed the air again. Vanessa seized it. Exactly. I acted within approved authority. For a second, the evidence appeared to point above her rather than at her. Dan did not look triumphant. Authority explains access. It doesn't explain the pattern. Marcus laid 6 complaint summaries across the gold chair, each aligned with an identical 10-minute gap in camera 9. The same phrases repeated. The same misspelling repeated. The same back corridor appeared in 6 different accounts. Richard's hand lowered slowly from the microphone. Eleanor stood at the edge of the stage, saying nothing, waiting to see whether her son would protect the company's image or test the truth. Vanessa's voice tightened for the first time. These are unrelated personnel matters being manipulated by a contractor with no investigative authority. A guest near the front whispered, "He's making himself into a hero." Dan heard it and kept his eyes on Richard. "This isn't about making me right," he said. "It's about making sure the next report isn't written before the next person speaks." Richard turned to the hotel's legal counsel. "Verify the originals. Seal the room. No files leave." Vanessa stepped toward the chair. "That badge should not be included. It has no established ownership." Marcus placed the bronze founding partner badge beside the brass key. Under the ballroom lights, the old doorway emblem matched the one above Richard's head. Vanessa stared at it. That badge was supposed to stay in the archive. The words escaped before she could soften them. Eleanor raised her eyes. Richard did too. No one in the room moved. Legal counsel lifted the old recording box from Marcus's evidence pouch, connected it to the ballroom system, and found 2 preserved files. The first was labeled with Vanessa's name. The second was labeled Richard Whitmore. The first recording opened with 3 seconds of static. Then Vanessa's voice filled Founders Hall. "Move her through the back corridor before Richard sees her. If she reaches the room, the board will start asking questions." A glass touched a saucer near the front table and stayed there. No one coughed. No one whispered. Vanessa stood beside the gold chair with one hand still resting on her clipboard, but her fingers had begun to tremble against the metal clip. "That is an isolated sentence," she said. "It lacks operational context." Legal counsel checked the file signature, the device serial number, and the service log Marcus had preserved. "The recording is original," she said. "The timestamp matches the camera redirect." Marcus played the next section. Vanessa's voice returned, flatter this time, speaking to someone off the main channel. "Close the complaint before the investor review. Use the standard language. Confused, non-compliant, disruptive. Keep it out of the lobby file." The pen in Vanessa's hand slipped free and struck the marble. The small plastic click seemed louder than the speakers. Dan did not look at her. He kept one palm on the back of the chair Lucy had asked him to pull out, the same chair that now held the false report, the brass key, the camera log, and the bronze badge. Eleanor stood beside him in her gray janitor uniform. She had not changed clothes, removed the cleaning gloves from her pocket, or asked for a place on the stage. Richard looked toward counsel. "Verify the second file." She opened the recording labeled with his name. His own voice came through the hall. "I don't want operational details. Keep investors comfortable and keep complaints off the front page." Richard's face did not collapse. It emptied. Vanessa turned toward him as though his words might rescue her. "You approved the standards. You authorized my access. I followed the structure you gave me." Richard stared at the repeated complaint language spread across the chair. "I authorized discretion. You authorized results. And chose not to ask how they were achieved," Eleanor said. It was the first time she had addressed him directly. Legal counsel placed a certified corporate record on the projection table. The original Whitmore doorway emblem appeared on the screen, followed by the 1987 incorporation page. Beneath Thomas Whitmore's signature was another name, Eleanor Whitmore, founding partner. A second image showed the opening night photograph, unfolded and restored. The younger woman beside Thomas wore the bronze badge now lying on the gold chair. Richard lowered his eyes. Around the room, donors who had ignored Eleanor minutes earlier stopped looking at her uniform and began looking at the floor. Eleanor stepped forward, removed the plastic janitor tag from her chest, and placed the bronze badge on the chair. Metal touched wood with one quiet note. She looked at Vanessa. How many people did you send through the back door before you tried it with the woman who built the front one? Vanessa opened her mouth, but no explanation came. Her gaze moved toward the cameras, then away. The professional smile that had survived every accusation was gone. Eleanor did not sit in the chair. She turned it toward the service aisle, where the gray-haired banquet server Vanessa had moved. From the front tables was still standing with a tray against her hip. Please, Eleanor said. Sit down. The server looked around as though the invitation must belong to someone else. Dan took the tray from her hands. She lowered herself into the gold chair, and the room watched an employee receive the dignity it had denied a founder. Lucy released a breath and slipped her hand into Dan's. Is she safe now? She whispered. The truth is, Dan said, people still have to act on it. Richard stepped away from the podium and switched off his own microphone. Effective immediately, Vanessa Cole is suspended pending independent investigation. All related employee files, camera logs, and executive communications are to be sealed. The restructuring transaction is frozen. He turned toward the board. I am transferring operational authority until my role is reviewed. Vanessa's clipboard slid from her hand and struck the carpeted step without a sound. Security did not touch her. Marcus simply asked for her access card and documented the time when she surrendered it. Dan gathered the original files into the evidence pouch and signed the transfer sheet. He did not ask for his contract to be protected. He did not ask the guests to remember who had been right. When several phones lifted toward Eleanor and the seated server, he lowered a movable stage panel to shield the employees waiting behind them from becoming scenery in someone else's scandal. Eleanor noticed. So did Richard. The applause began unevenly, but Eleanor raised one hand and stopped it. Do not applaud because the woman in the uniform had a title, she said. Ask what would have happened if she did not. The silence returned, deeper than before. Dan looked down at Sarah's worn watch as Eleanor's eyes settled on its scratched steel back. Her face changed with a recognition unrelated to the badge, the hotel, or the investigation. Sarah Mercer, she said softly. Dan's hand went still. Eleanor knew his wife's name, and as the room waited to reward him for what he had done, Dan had no idea whether the truth approaching him would become a gift, a debt, or one more test of the man he intended to remain. The guests left Founders Hall without the bright noise that usually followed a successful gala. Phones disappeared into coat pockets. Donors who had spent years speaking over servers now stepped aside to let them pass. Marcus sealed the recording box, the camera logs, the false incident report, and the anonymous letters in separate evidence bags while legal counsel read each number aloud. Vanessa surrendered her access card, then walked through the same service corridor she had used to hide others, accompanied not by shame or spectacle, but by 2 compliance officers documenting every step. Richard remained near the darkened stage as the board suspended his authority and appointed an outside investigator. Before midnight, every open complaint connected to Camera 9 was frozen from deletion. By morning, former employees would be contacted, damaged personnel records would be reviewed, and the visual suitability memo would become evidence instead of policy. Eleanor watched the process without asking anyone to call her Mrs. Whitmore. She kept the gray uniform on. Sarah wore that watch during the fire inspection 18 years ago, she told Dan when only staff and investigators remained. Dan looked down at the scratched steel on his wrist. Eleanor explained that Sarah had been a young accessibility consultant then, hired for 1 week to review emergency routes. She had objected when management proposed locking the North Ballroom service passage during investor events. The burned chair had come from a small electrical fire that followed. Sarah helped carry 2 dishwashers out before the smoke reached the ballroom, then wrote a report warning that image-conscious shortcuts would eventually hurt someone. The report had disappeared into the archive. She refused my thank you check, Eleanor said. She told me to fix the door. Dan rubbed his thumb across the watchband. Did you? Eleanor looked toward the open service corridor. Not well enough. She offered him no inheritance, no dramatic title, and no promise that grief could be repaired by opportunity. Instead, she asked him to serve on the Independent Worker Safety Review with full authority to challenge event procedures and direct access to the board. Not because you found my badge, she said. Because you protected the truth before you knew who it belonged to. Dan did not answer immediately. Lucy had fallen asleep in a banquet chair with her yellow tablet case tucked against her chest. The sight of her made the choice simple. I'll do it if former employees get seats at the table, he said. Paid seats. And if complaints cannot be routed through the managers they name. Eleanor extended her hand. Agreed. Richard approached after signing his temporary removal papers. His voice had lost the polished rhythm of the stage. You could have destroyed me in front of everyone. Dan looked at him. The recording told the truth. I didn't need to add humiliation. Richard nodded once, absorbing the boundary rather than mistaking it for forgiveness. Dan continued, You still answer for what you ignored. I know. Then start by listening when nobody important is in the room. 3 weeks later, the gold chair stood in the front lobby beneath no velvet rope and no founder's portrait. A small plaque explained that it had once been removed from an elderly worker and returned by a child who asked why no one would help her. Beneath it was a second line listing the names of the 6 employees whose complaints had been reopened and corrected. The North Ballroom Archive became a worker resource office with private reporting access, paid advocates, and cameras controlled by independent security rather than guest experience management. The back corridor remained open during every event. Dan returned to work wearing the same modest suit and carrying the same scuffed event binder. People greeted him differently now, but he still checked exit routes, carried boxes when crews were short, and ate lunch in the break room. Eleanor sometimes joined him there without the janitor tag, though she still poured her own coffee. Lucy no longer asked whether the woman was safe. She saw adults proving it through locked records, restored names, and doors that could no longer be quietly closed. On the first night of the new program, the former gray-haired banquet server sat in the gold chair while Eleanor handed her a corrected employment file. No applause followed. Sarah's watch ticked softly on Dan's wrist. The brass key rested in a glass case beside the open corridor. And for one long moment everyone simply understood that dignity had never needed a title to be real. Kindness had only needed someone brave enough to pull out the chair, and patient enough to stay until justice sat down.